what Emily said at Daniel's funeral? My sister Linda's voice cut through the laughter of the family reunion like a sudden winter breeze. And within seconds the entire dining room went quiet. We had gathered that Saturday afternoon at my nephew's ranch-style house just outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place with a wide wooden deck, folding lawn chairs scattered across the backyard, and the smell of grilled burgers drifting through the warm air. It was supposed to be one of those easy family days where cousins told old stories, and someone inevitably argued about football scores from 20 years ago. I was standing near the long buffet table, holding a paper plate with a slice of apple pie I hadn't even touched yet, when Linda said those words. At 68 years old, I've learned that silence in a room full of relatives usually means one thing. Someone is about to reveal something nobody expected to hear. I looked at her across the table, confused at first, because the question felt like it belonged to another time entirely. Daniel had been gone for almost 2 years. His funeral had taken place on a cold gray morning in February, the kind of day when the wind slips through your coat no matter how tightly you button it. For a moment I didn't answer Linda, because I honestly wasn't sure what she meant. But then the memory returned to me all at once, clear and sharp, like a photograph you thought you had lost but suddenly found again in the back of a drawer. The funeral home had been quiet that day, filled with the soft sound of people speaking in hushed voices and the low hum of the heating system fighting the winter cold outside. I remember standing beside Daniel's casket, greeting friends who had driven in from different parts of the state. My hands were shaking so much I kept wrapping them around a cup of coffee just to steady myself. That was when Emily, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, stepped closer to me. She leaned in the way people do when they want to speak privately in a crowded room. At the time, I thought she was going to offer comfort. After all, we had been part of the same family for more than 20 years. Instead, she spoke in a soft, calm voice that I can still hear even now. "Don't worry," she whispered, glancing briefly toward the front door of the chapel. "The house will finally belong to us." I remember blinking at her, certain I must have misunderstood. The words didn't make sense in that moment. My husband had just passed away, and the only thing on my mind was how strange the world felt without him in it. I gave her a polite nod and assumed grief had made me hear something wrong. But now, standing in my nephew's dining room with every pair of eyes turning toward me, I realized Linda had heard it too. And judging by the look on her face, she had never forgotten that sentence either. For a long moment, no one at the reunion table said anything. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room resting on me, waiting for my answer. But my mind had already drifted back to that winter morning nearly 2 years earlier. The funeral had ended around noon, and after the last visitors left the chapel I drove back to the house Daniel and I had shared for 3 decades. The sky above Columbus was the pale gray color that comes before snow, and the roads were quiet except for the soft sound of my tires rolling across the pavement. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. A 2-story brick home with white shutters and the small maple tree Daniel planted the year we moved in. But stepping inside felt different. The silence was heavier, almost unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves understood that something permanent had changed. I placed my coat over the back of a chair and walked slowly through the living room, touching the edge of the bookshelf Daniel built with his own hands 25 years earlier. Every corner of that house carried a memory. Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch, Christmas lights glowing in the windows, summer evenings when the grandchildren ran through the yard chasing fireflies. That was why Emily's words at the funeral felt so strange when I remembered them later that evening. At first I told myself it must have been a misunderstanding. Grief has a way of twisting ordinary sentences into something sharper than they were meant to be. But over the next few weeks, small things began to happen that I could not easily explain away. Emily started visiting more often than she ever had before. She would sit at the kitchen table with a careful smile and ask gentle questions about paperwork. She asked whether Daniel had kept copies of the mortgage records. She wondered if I had located the most recent insurance documents. One afternoon she even asked whether the original property deed was stored in the house or at the bank. Each question sounded polite on the surface, yet every one of them circled around the same subject without saying it directly. The house. At first I answered casually, believing she was simply helping organize the details that follow a loss. After all, Emily worked as a financial assistant in Dayton, and she had always described herself as someone who liked keeping things organized. But the pattern continued. Every visit somehow returned to that same topic. She would glance around the living room, studying the windows and the staircase the way a real estate agent might evaluate a property. One evening she even stood near the back door and said quietly that homes in our neighborhood were selling for nearly $400,000 now, which was almost twice what Daniel and I had paid for it back in 1993. I remember smiling politely while she spoke, yet something about the tone of her voice made that memory from the funeral echo in my mind again. Do not worry, the house will finally belong to us. At the time I still hoped those words had meant something else. But deep down, a quiet uneasiness had already begun to settle into my thoughts. Standing in my nephew's dining room at the reunion, I realized that the uneasy feeling I had tried to ignore for almost 2 years had never truly disappeared. Linda was still watching me carefully from across the table, her expression calm but firm, as if she had decided that the truth needed to be spoken no matter how uncomfortable it made the afternoon. Around us, the familiar sounds of the gathering had completely faded. Even the children playing in the backyard had grown quiet, and the only noise inside the house was the faint hum of the air conditioner pushing cool air through the vents. I took a slow breath and set my untouched plate of pie down on the table because my hands had begun to tremble slightly. The truth was that Emily's questions about the house had not stopped after those first few visits. In fact, they had slowly become more direct as the months passed. I remember one particular afternoon in early spring when she arrived carrying a small notebook and a pen, the way someone might show up prepared for an appointment rather than a casual family visit. She sat across from me at the kitchen table where the sunlight fell through the large window Daniel had installed years earlier, and she began asking about the history of the property itself. She wanted to know exactly when Daniel and I purchased the house, how much the mortgage had been, and whether any renovations had increased the value. At first I answered politely because I believed she was simply curious. But when she asked whether Daniel had ever considered transferring the property into joint ownership with her name included, I remember feeling a quiet pause settle over the conversation. That was not the sort of question a daughter usually asked her father's widow. I told her gently that Daniel and I had always handled our finances together, and that the house had been our shared home since 1993. She nodded, but there was a thoughtful look in her eyes that I could not quite read. A few days later she returned again, this time mentioning that a friend of hers worked at a real estate office in Dayton, and had recently sold a property almost identical to ours for nearly $420,000. She spoke about it casually, almost like someone discussing the weather, yet every sentence seemed to circle back to the same idea. Property values were rising. Houses in our neighborhood were in demand. People were moving to Columbus from other states and looking for quiet streets with mature trees and solid brick homes. I listened politely while she explained all of this, but deep inside I could feel the memory of that whisper at the funeral pressing harder against my thoughts. Do not worry, the house will finally belong to us. For months I tried to convince myself that Emily's curiosity came from practical concerns rather than ambition. Still, late at night when the house was quiet and the hallway clock ticked softly on the wall, I sometimes wondered whether Daniel had anticipated something I did not yet understand. There had been one evening shortly before he passed away when he looked around the living room with a thoughtful expression and told me that some decisions must be made carefully in order to protect the things that matter most. At the time I assumed he meant the memories we had built in that house. Now, standing in the middle of the reunion with my family waiting for me to respond, I began to wonder if Daniel had been thinking about something else entirely. At the reunion table I finally looked at Linda and gave a slow nod, because by that point I understood exactly what memory she was talking about. A quiet murmur moved through the room as relatives exchanged glances, but Linda did not look away from me. She simply waited, patient and steady, the same way she had done many times when we were children growing up in our small house in Dayton. For a moment I felt as though the years had folded in on themselves and brought me back to a conversation I had nearly forgotten. It had taken place about 6 months before Daniel passed away, on an ordinary autumn evening when the air outside carried the smell of fallen leaves. Daniel had been sitting in his favorite chair in the living room, the one beside the lamp where he liked to read the newspaper after dinner. I was folding laundry on the couch when he suddenly looked up and said something that seemed strangely serious for such a quiet night. He asked me whether I had ever thought about what might happen to the house one day. At the time I laughed softly and told him that I planned to grow old right there in that living room. Daniel smiled at that, but there was a thoughtful look behind his eyes that I did not fully understand then. He set the newspaper aside and said that a home is more than wood and brick. It is also the life that grows inside it. He reminded me how we had painted the kitchen cabinets together the summer after we moved in, how we built the back deck board by board during a heat wave in 1998, and how every Thanksgiving our dining room table had stretched so far across the room that people had to slide their chairs sideways just to sit down. Then he told me something else, something that felt unusual coming from a man who normally preferred simple conversations about gardening and baseball scores. He said that sometimes people see a house only as a number written on a piece of paper. He said that value can make people forget what a place truly means. I remember asking him why he suddenly sounded like a lawyer preparing a lecture. Daniel laughed quietly at that and told me he had recently met with an attorney to organize some paperwork, nothing dramatic, just the kind of planning responsible people should do after 60. I did not ask many questions because Daniel had always been careful with finances and I trusted his judgment completely. What I did not know at the time was that the conversation had happened only 2 weeks after Emily visited him alone one afternoon while I was running errands across town. Later she mentioned that they had talked about family history and old photographs, but now, looking back at the way Daniel studied the walls of the living room that evening, I began to wonder if their conversation had included something more serious. Standing in the middle of the reunion years later, with the sound of my relatives breathing quietly around the table, I realized that Daniel's words about protecting what matters most might not have been a simple reflection about memories at all. It might have been a warning that he had already seen something coming long before I did. The room at the reunion remained so quiet that I could hear the faint clink of ice shifting inside someone's glass across the table. Linda still had not looked away from me, and by now the rest of the family understood that something important was unfolding. I folded my hands together slowly, not because I was nervous, but because the memories I had pushed aside for so long were finally lining up in a way that made sense. After Daniel passed away and the weeks of condolences slowly faded, life inside the house became quieter than I had ever experienced. The mornings were the hardest. For more than 30 years Daniel had been the first one awake, always starting the coffee maker before the sun came up. Now the kitchen felt too still when I walked in each day, and sometimes I would pause beside the counter just remembering the sound of his voice humming along with the old country songs he liked to play on the radio. It was during those early months that Emily's visits continued. At first she came every couple of weeks, bringing a small box of pastries or a grocery bag with fruit. She would sit at the kitchen table and talk politely about work and about the long drive from Dayton to Columbus. But gradually those visits became less about family conversation and more about practical questions. One afternoon she arrived carrying a folder filled with neatly organized papers. She spread them across the table like someone preparing for a meeting at an office rather than a visit with her father's widow. She explained that she had been researching property records online and noticed that the homes in our neighborhood had increased in value by nearly 30% over the past 5 years. She pointed out that the average sale price had climbed above $400,000, and that buyers were especially interested in older brick houses with large backyards like ours. I listened quietly while she spoke, nodding when it felt polite, but the entire time I kept remembering the look Daniel had given me that autumn evening when he talked about protecting what mattered most. Emily eventually asked whether I had located Daniel's will yet. I told her that the attorney who handled Daniel's paperwork had contacted me shortly after the funeral and explained that everything was already organized. When I said that, Emily leaned back in her chair and studied my face carefully, as if she were measuring something she could not quite see. Then she asked a question that made the room feel a little colder despite the warm spring sunlight pouring through the window. She asked whether Daniel had ever discussed placing the house into shared ownership with family members, so that future decisions could be made together. I remember smiling gently and telling her that Daniel always believed a home should belong to the people who built their life inside it. Emily nodded slowly at my answer, but there was a brief moment when her expression changed in a way I could not easily describe. It was not anger and it was not sadness. It looked more like someone quietly recalculating a plan that had not gone exactly the way they expected. At the time I did not challenge her questions because I believed patience was the best way to handle grief inside a family. But standing at the reunion now, with Linda reminding everyone what had been whispered at the funeral, I finally understood that those visits had never been simple conversations at all. They had been careful attempts to discover whether the future of the house matched the future Emily had already imagined. At the reunion table, I could feel the story slowly unfolding in front of everyone, piece by piece, the way a puzzle finally reveals its picture when the last few pieces are turned the right direction. Linda crossed her arms gently and leaned back in her chair, giving me space to continue, but her eyes still carried the quiet determination of someone who had waited a long time to say what needed to be said. I glanced around the room and saw familiar faces that had known me for decades. Cousins who remembered the early years when Daniel and I first bought the house. Relatives who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at the same long wooden table more times than anyone could count. They all understood that the house was never just a building to me. It was where our life had grown slowly over 30 years. The garden in the backyard still had the rose bushes Daniel planted the summer he turned 50. The small workshop in the garage still held the wooden shelves he built during winter weekends when the snow piled up along the driveway. Every corner of that place carried the quiet fingerprints of our shared history. That was why the pattern of Emily's visits eventually began to feel less like concern and more like strategy. About 4 months after the funeral, she arrived one evening with an unusually cheerful tone, the kind people use when they believe they are about to deliver good news. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table and explained that she had been thinking about the future of the property. She spoke carefully, almost like someone presenting a proposal in a meeting. She mentioned that maintaining a large house could become difficult for someone living alone. She pointed out that the property taxes had increased slightly in Franklin County during the past few years. She also reminded me that many older homeowners eventually chose to downsize into smaller places that required less maintenance. While she spoke, she kept glancing toward the back window where the yard stretched across nearly half an acre, the maple tree Daniel planted now tall enough to shade the entire deck in the afternoon. When she finally paused, she suggested that perhaps the house could eventually be sold while the market remained strong. She explained that a sale might allow everyone in the family to benefit from the value Daniel had built over the years. The way she used the word everyone caught my attention immediately. I asked her gently what she meant by that. Emily hesitated for a moment and then said that if the house were sold, the proceeds could be divided in a fair and practical way between family members who had a connection to Daniel's legacy. She said the sentence with such calm confidence that it almost sounded rehearsed. I remember studying her face quietly and realizing something important at that moment. Emily was not speaking about a distant possibility. In her mind, the decision had already been made long ago. She believed the house would eventually become part of her future plans, the same way someone might assume they will inherit an old family photograph album. But what she did not know was that Daniel had never been careless when it came to protecting the things he loved. And the quiet conversation we shared in the living room that autumn evening had not been a simple reflection about memories after all. It had been the beginning of a decision that would change everything she thought she knew about the future of that house. The dining room at the reunion felt different now, as if the warm afternoon gathering had quietly transformed into something far more serious. No one interrupted, and no one tried to change the subject. Linda slowly placed her glass down on the table and finally spoke again, her voice calm but steady. She said that she had not planned to mention the funeral that day, but after watching the way Emily had been behaving during the reunion, she felt it was time the family understood what had really happened. I turned slightly in my chair, following Linda's gaze toward the far end of the table where Emily sat beside her husband. Emily had been unusually quiet since the conversation began, stirring the ice in her drink while pretending to study something on her phone. Linda then explained something that even I had not known for nearly 2 years. She told everyone that when Emily leaned toward me at the funeral and whispered those words about the house, Linda had been standing only a few feet away. She had heard the entire sentence clearly. At the time, she had assumed grief might have caused Emily to say something thoughtless, so she chose to remain silent out of respect for the moment. But over the following months, she began to notice the same pattern that I had quietly experienced. Emily asked questions about the house whenever family members spoke on the phone. She mentioned property values during holiday visits. She even once joked during a Christmas dinner that real estate in Columbus had become one of the safest investments in the Midwest. Linda said that the more she listened, the more she remembered that sentence from the funeral and the tone in which it had been spoken. It was not the voice of someone mourning her father. It sounded more like someone waiting patiently for a door to open. As Linda finished explaining this, the room remained silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could see several relatives exchanging uneasy looks because the story now formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Emily finally looked up from her phone, her expression controlled but noticeably tense. She gave a small polite laugh and said that everyone must be misunderstanding an innocent comment from a difficult day. But the moment she said that, I realized something important. For nearly 2 years I had avoided confronting the situation directly because I believed peace inside a family was worth protecting. Yet standing there now, surrounded by people who had known Daniel and me for most of our lives, I understood that the truth had quietly waited long enough. I folded my hands together on the table and looked toward Emily calmly. My voice remained steady as I spoke, because anger was not necessary anymore. Daniel had already made sure of that long before anyone realized what was coming, and the decision he made during those final months was about to become very clear to everyone in that room. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, the room remained completely still. The late afternoon sunlight coming through the windows cast long shadows across the dining table, and I could see the uncertainty on several faces as everyone waited to hear what I would say next. Emily shifted slightly in her chair and gave another small laugh, though this one sounded tighter than before. She said that everyone was turning a simple misunderstanding into something far more dramatic than it needed to be. She explained that people say strange things during emotional moments, and that perhaps Linda had simply misheard the conversation at the funeral. I listened patiently, allowing her to finish without interruption, because by now I understood that none of this required an argument. When Emily finally stopped speaking, I folded my hands together on the table and looked at her calmly. I told her that she was correct about one thing. Grief does cause confusion sometimes, but legal paperwork does not rely on emotion or memory. It relies on clear decisions made in quiet offices long before moments like this ever occur. Several relatives leaned forward slightly as I said this, sensing that the story had reached the point Daniel had quietly prepared for years earlier. I explained that about 6 months before he passed away, Daniel had scheduled a meeting with an estate attorney in downtown Columbus. At the time he told me he simply wanted to organize our documents so that I would not face unnecessary complications if something ever happened to him. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, and afterward he seemed relieved in a way I did not fully understand then. A few days later he showed me a folder containing copies of the documents that had been finalized during that appointment. Inside that folder was something called a living trust. Daniel had decided to place our home into that trust, so that its future would be protected without confusion or dispute. I remember asking him why such a step was necessary when we had already lived peacefully in that house for decades. Daniel smiled gently and told me that good planning prevents unnecessary problems later. Standing at the reunion table now, I explained to everyone that the trust named me as the sole lifetime beneficiary of the property. That meant the house remained entirely under my control for as long as I chose to live there. No one else could sell it, transfer it, or divide its value without my decision. I also explained that Daniel had added one final instruction inside the document. After my lifetime, the house would be donated to a local housing foundation that helps families in Franklin County find stable homes. When I finished explaining this, the silence in the room deepened in a completely different way than before. It was the quiet understanding that comes when a long question finally receives a clear answer. I looked toward Emily again and spoke gently but firmly, not with anger but with simple honesty. Daniel loved his family, but he also believed that a home should remain with the person who built a life inside it, not the person who calculated its market value. And long before anyone realized what was happening, he had already made sure that promise would remain intact. For a moment after I finished explaining Daniel's decision, no one at the reunion table spoke at all. The silence felt different now, not tense or uncertain, but settled, like the calm that arrives after a long storm finally passes. I could see the understanding slowly spread across the faces around the room. My cousins exchanged quiet glances, and my nephew leaned back in his chair as if he had just heard the final piece of a story that had taken years to unfold. Emily remained still for several seconds. The confident expression she had worn earlier in the afternoon had softened into something far more restrained. She looked down at the glass in front of her, slowly turning it between her hands as though trying to find the right response. Eventually, she cleared her throat and said that she had never intended for any misunderstanding to grow this large. She explained that she had only been thinking about practical matters, and that she believed families should discuss property decisions openly. Her words sounded careful, almost rehearsed, but there was a noticeable lack of certainty behind them now. I listened politely, because by this point there was no reason to argue or defend anything further. Daniel had already answered the question long before this reunion ever took place. After Emily finished speaking, I simply nodded once and looked around the table at the people who had shared so many chapters of life with me and Daniel. I told them that Daniel always believed a home should carry the spirit of the people who built their lives inside it. He believed that walls and roofs mattered less than the laughter, the quiet dinners, the holiday traditions, and the memories that slowly filled every room over time. That was why he chose to protect the house in a way that would keep it meaningful rather than turning it into a simple financial transaction. As the conversation slowly shifted back to ordinary topics, the atmosphere in the room gradually relaxed again. Someone in the kitchen began pouring fresh lemonade, and the sound of children laughing outside drifted through the open screen door. I stepped out onto the back porch for a moment, letting the warm Ohio evening air settle around me. Across the yard I could see the same kind of maple tree Daniel once planted in our backyard years ago, its branches moving gently in the breeze. Standing there, I realized that the house Daniel and I built together had never truly been about ownership or value. It had always been about the life we created inside it, day by day, season after season. And because Daniel understood that better than anyone, he made sure the future of that home would always reflect the care and patience we spent building it together. Sometimes people believe they are waiting for an opportunity to claim something valuable, but what they forget is that true value often lies in the quiet decisions made long before anyone begins to compete for it. Daniel knew that, and in the end, that quiet wisdom protected everything that mattered most.